This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Our graphics division at the Clements Library is comprised of visual materials of many genres and formats. The collection is curated to support the overall subject strengths found in the library's books, manuscripts, and maps, as well as offering unique research opportunities in American visual culture. The bulk of the graphics holdings are in prints and photographs, supplemented with original artwork, printed ephemera, sheet music, and other visual materials. Oh, I'm moving again? All right, great, thank you. Hopefully the internet has stabilized, so fingers crossed that we're good. Our speaker today is Jacob Dopp, who has been at the Clements Library since 2017 and works as a cataloger in the graphics division as well as supporting research activities. And we're very lucky to have Dick Pohrt here to participate in the Q&A afterwards as we discuss the Pohrt collection of Native American photography. So that will be really delightful to have his expertise and input at that time. Just one quick tutorial note. As you think of questions, if you can, go to the Q&A box. That would be a great place for you to put your questions rather than the chat, just so that we can keep track of them. And within there, you can also see the questions that other people have had and click a thumbs up icon to like the comment. And then also you can reply to an existing question. So if you have sort of something to add on to that question, or you have some sort of answer to that question, please feel free to click on comment and write a reply there as well. So let's see. I'm going to stop the share for just a second and get things queued up for Jacob's presentation, and we'll talk some more after it.
Hello, and welcome to this virtual History of Photography presentation. My name is Jacob Dopp, and I am a cataloger in the Graphics Division of the William L. Clements Library. Today, I will be discussing a few issues and examples related to misidentifications in the Richard Pohrt Jr. collection of Native American photography. The Pohrt collection contains over 1,000 individual photographs related to Native Americans and Native American history. During the process of cataloging these materials, it became abundantly clear that for many reasons, information that came attached to certain photographs in the form of printed captions and handwritten inscriptions could not always be taken at face value. Individuals can be misidentified, while indigenous names can be mistranslated or rendered phonetically into English in many different variations. Sometimes photographers or any one of a succession of owners might even have intentionally misrepresented aspects of a given photograph in order to increase the value of that image. In handling the Pohrt collection, extensive background research into each and every photograph was performed in order to try and correct as many historically embedded inaccuracies as possible. This photograph bears an inscribed caption that reads, "Seminole Chief, son of Billy Bowlegs." The back of this image also contains a written extract from a letter describing the supposed context in which this photograph was taken. According to the Verso inscription, the man in this photo was a son of Bill Bowlegs, a Seminole chief who served with Osceola during the Second Seminole War. Further research into the name Billy Bowlegs yielded some intriguing information. There were indeed two Seminole chiefs named Billy Bowlegs, including one that fought against the United States during the Seminole Wars. However, it turns out that the man in this photograph was not related to the preceding Billy Bowlegs by blood. Born in 1862 to an African-American father and a mixed-race Seminole mother, his English name was Billy Fewell. Apparently, he received the name Billy Bowlegs at the age of 15 during a coming-of-age ceremony, and throughout his adult life he was often referred to as Billy Bowlegs III. The attribution of Fewell as being a son of Billy Bowlegs was likely just one of many honest mistakes derived from misunderstandings related to traditional Native American customs. Besides handwritten inscriptions, official printed captions can also sometimes be just as suspect. These two examples are both from a series of images produced by Stanley J. Morrow, a photographer based in the Dakota Territory primarily during the 1870s and 80s. The full designated titles of these photos can be found in the official series listings printed on the backs of these and other related images. As you can see, both captions seemingly imply that the Mandan tribe were somehow related to the Welsh, which is of course a preposterous notion. That being said, why did Morrow caption these images in this way? As it turns out, the roots of this Welsh Indian hypothesis extend all the way back to Queen Elizabeth I of England, who, in vying with Spain for colonial supremacy in the New World, decided to propagate a theory involving a legendary Welsh prince from the 12th century. Prince Madoc of Wales supposedly fled his country by ship after his father's death led to warfare among his siblings, and he was never seen or heard from again. Latching on to this folk legend, Elizabeth cleverly deployed it against Spain by claiming that Prince Madoc had actually sailed to North America 300 years prior to Columbus, thus undermining the legitimacy of Spanish claims in the New World. Over time, this legend continued to evolve, eventually manifesting in the idea that certain tribes west of the Mississippi River, in particular the Mandan, were actually descendants of Prince Madoc's party. The following studio portrait by photographic duo Lenny and Sawyers bears the caption, Enoch, Delaware, which has been painted directly onto the glass plate negative. An inscription on the verso of this picture also informs us that this subject's surname is Hogue. Taken at face value, the individual in this portrait is a Delaware chief named Enoch Hogue. Simple enough, right? However, further research reveals that this caption is indeed partially erroneous. After looking up the name Enoch Hogue on the internet, one entry on findagrave.com caught my eye. The picture of the gravestone confirms that Enoch Hogue was actually the last chief of the Caddo tribe. Also, the porcelain cameo photo embedded onto the gravestone is the very same portrait in which he is misidentified as a Delaware chief. Taking all of this into account, the question remains, how exactly did the photographers manage to misidentify this person's tribal affiliation? One possibility in this case is that because Enoch was actually married to a Delaware woman, perhaps this could have caused some confusion in the photography studio with regards to Hoag's own tribal origins. The final example I've selected is a portrait of a Native American man identified in the official caption as Chief Young Man Afraid of His Horses, leading chief of all the Sioux. The photographers, Gus Traeger and Frederick Kuhn, were a German-American duo who were active for a short time in the Nebraska-South Dakota border region during the late 1880s, before their partnership eventually broke down. Interestingly, despite the fact this photo is on a Traeger and Kuhn mount, the caption provided on the negative image plate could have only been made after the dissolution of their partnership, because it indicates that the copyright was held by the Northwestern Photographic Company. This company was forged by Traeger and a new partner, Joe Ford, and seems to have been a means for copywriting and profiting off of images related to the ghost dance movement and the horrific Wounded Knee Massacre, which sadly were quite profitable. Here we have another portrait copyrighted by the Northwestern Photographic Company that also purports to show young man afraid of his horses, this time standing outdoors in front of his teepee. Let's see what happens when we compare these portraits, as well as an additional third image. Clearly, the individual from the first portrait at far left is not the same person as the man in the other two photos, who is young man afraid of his horses. This begs the question then, if this man is not young man afraid, then who is he? It turns out that the man in the Traeger and Kuhn portrait is also present in another photo found in the Pohrt collection. Seen here alongside one of his wives, Chief Appleton, also known as Wooden Lance, is considered to have been the last traditional chief of the Kiowa people. Appleton was the son of Red Otter, a Kiowa chief, and a Lakota woman with family ties to the famous Sioux chief Red Cloud. Apparently, Appleton was part of a group of leaders from several reservations in Indian Territory that were sent north to dwell among the Sioux for an extended period of time in order to learn more about the new Messianic ghost dance movement. Traeger and Kuhn most likely photographed him while he was staying in Lakota country. Side-by-side comparison with other portraits confirms that the man in the Traeger and Kuhn photograph, seen at center, is indeed Appleton, and not young man afraid of his horses. While it's impossible to say with complete certainty, it does seem most plausible that this misidentification occurred as a result of poor record-keeping and the relative similarity in the two chiefs' appearances, as opposed to anything nefarious or intentional. By taking the time to thoroughly research the people, places, and events represented in the photographs in the Pohrt collection, the Clements Library strives to rectify as many historical misattributions as possible in order to ensure that we do not continue to perpetuate such inaccuracies into the future. This concludes today's presentation. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you, Jacob.
Well, of course.
That was great. So hopefully we have some good questions along the way. As I mentioned earlier, If you have a question, it would be great if you type it into the Q&A box, and we will answer some of those. Maybe while we're waiting to see if people have questions, I know, I hope that many of you have already had a chance to hear about the Pohrt collection. We've had several blog posts and some press release and those kinds of things. But maybe, Jacob, if you wouldn't mind just giving a brief overview, that would be great.
I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, Dick, feel free to jump in with any comments. Yeah, the gist of it is the Pohrt collection consists currently of well over 1,000 individual photos, as well as several photograph albums that pertain to Native American history. The vast majority of them are studio portraits of Native American individuals. Probably say the vast majority of them are unidentified individuals. And you have a mixture of men, women, children. What has really struck me over the course of cataloging this collection, which took the better part of a year, which is substantially longer than projects like this would normally take. It took so long because of the extensive amount of research that went into a lot of these photos to really try to unpack, just who are these individuals? Is this really what the caption says it is? Things like that. And I think it's an absolutely wonderful resource, both for studying Native American history and some of the individuals involved, but also studying the field of photography, 19th century photography, and some of the practices inherent to that time. I think this is a wonderful resource in terms of studying the nature of Native American photography and why are there so many systemic issues in this subgenre of photography in particular with regards to identity and misrepresentation. Because I only touched on examples of individuals being explicitly misidentified as someone else or belonging to a different tribe. There's many, many different facets of misidentification that I didn't elaborate on. A big one is actually, the image itself being staged, doctored in a certain way. There's numerous examples of, you'll see studio props, including there's one photo I touched on during the presentation last week of a Ute chief named Chief Johnson, where he was holding a scalp lock staff. On the internet, I found another image taken by the same photographer in the same studio, a different person holding that exact same scalp lock staff, and it was clearly a studio prop. And one of the resources that I linked for today's talk is a really fantastic article by Joanna Cohen-Shear, which is all about some of the issues inherent with Native American photography and this question of, okay, there's all this staging going on behind the scenes, including, she talks about all these early expeditions of the American West that transpired in the 1870s, and how some of the people leading these expeditions would go so far as to even make buckskins made to order, have those shipped into the expedition so they can outfit some of the Native American scouts helping them with the expedition, take photos of them. And there's just so many layers that you need to be able to look at with a critical eye and peel back and really, in order to really fully assess some of these photos and the field as a whole. There's a lot you need to take into account.
Yes, yes. And if people missed last week's discussion, we do have it recorded. We just haven't had a chance to get it up on the website yet, but we can include a link in the email that we send out today. So along those lines, I just want to follow up and mention that part of the reason we were able to do such in-depth research is we did receive grant funding from the Kriebel Foundation for cataloging this collection and from the Upton Foundation to do part of this project as well. And so we're really grateful for that kind of opportunity. And I see that Ron McCready is asking how much time you think you spent on each photo.
Well, good question. It really, really depends on the photo. There are some that are, pretty straightforward. There's pre-existing catalog records for those images that I can extrapolate information from. And if there is not too much amiss, those are pretty straightforward to knock those out pretty rapidly. For ones where, maybe there's little known about the subject, or there's indications that there might be some staging going on, or clearly, I've looked, once you look at enough of these photos and you look at the same face over and over again, when you see one that doesn't fit and something just sticks out, like, no, this doesn't look like the other photos of that person. Once you get issues like that at play, then the amount of time spent per photo really starts ratcheting up. I mean, there's some that I still, if I'm like the last one, the example of Chief Apiaton, I still am trying to get to the bottom of that photograph. I don't know if I ever will, because there's that issue with, it's on a Traeger and Kuhn mount, which a lot of photographers, their partnerships changed all the time, and they would have mounts made when they were in a previous partnership. They would still hang on to these and maybe recycle them just to be cost effective. But then the whole question of the image caption being written on that negative plate could have only been done when Traeger had formed his new partnership. And I just learned this morning that apparently Apiaton had actually arrived at Pine Ridge Reservation in September, October of 1890. So that's probably when he had that photo taken. And then by the early days of 1891, I believe, the Traeger and Kuhn partnership had, for whatever reason, totally imploded. And then you see this new partnership forged. So I still can't rule out that perhaps Traeger intentionally mislabeled this photo because he didn't have a good close-up portrait of Young Man Afraid of His Horses. And he knew, with all the press surrounding this incident, and then in the aftermath, Young Man Afraid of His Horses ended up being kind of a stabilizing force in the area. And there was a great deal of press around all these chiefs, including Young Man Afraid. And you got to wonder if, maybe Traeger and Ford saw an opportunity to maybe fudge the identity of this person. Their customers would be none the wiser. And then they could stand to profit off this image that much more. Because that's another aspect that people need to keep in mind throughout all of this, is that these photographs aren't just being created in a vacuum. They're being created as part of a business enterprise. And you can never divorce that aspect from their creation. There's a photo I came across researching. There's a lot of photos in the Pohrt collection that are related to Sundance / 4th of July ceremonies. Because in the early 1880s, the United States government actually started outlawing many traditional indigenous practices, including religious customs. For the Plains Indians, this included the outlawing of the Sundance. And so, to make a very long story short, they eventually started performing kind of pseudo Sundance ceremonies right around the time of 4th of July, which is when the Sundance gatherings would be taking place. It sounds like Indian agents on these reservations kind of realized this was a good opportunity to kind of, maybe instill some sense of patriotism on these reservations, whilst also allowing them to partake in some of these traditional practices. But there are tons of photographs out there that, purport themselves as being photos of an actual Sundance ceremony taking place, which were very closely guarded. It was very hard to get access to these ceremonies, let alone take photos. That would be very much frowned upon. And there's one example in particular that I found online that actually, once I blew this image up and was looking at the scan very closely, first of all, the image of the dancer partaking in this particular ceremony was completely invented, completely drawn using the retouching on the negative image plate. It was completely painted on. And then I was startled to find later on, when I continued digging into this photo, that there's an entire front row of spectators that was cut out from a different photograph and put into this one to make a completely different image, and just to give more of a sense of spectacle. I found a few other invented elements as well, and it's very fascinating, and it speaks volumes about the market for these kinds of images and how photographers were taking advantage of these native peoples, and then also taking advantage of white Americans' ignorance of these people's customs and cultures.
Right, right. So we have several questions related, Dick, around how this collection came to be. So perhaps you'd like to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. First, let me say good job there, Jacob. You touched on a lot of very interesting issues that I was aware of when I was putting this collection together, and but my hat goes off to you for wrestling and resolving a lot of these things as you catalog the collection. And as we've talked about, Jacob and I have talked about this previously, there's a whole lecture there in and of itself where Jacob can talk about what things he's had to wrestle with and resolve as he tried to make sense of these often conflicting things about identity and phonetical spellings of native names and the translation into English and tribal identifications. We wanted credit the proper photographer. There was a whole period of things, images being pirated, especially of famous individuals, and remarketed by another photographer. So there's all kinds of things that keep popping up, and I want to see it done right. Clements Library wants to see it done right. We want to correct the record and make it an even more, a more useful tool. So I'll put that out there first. But how did I come to put this collection together? Well, it's been sort of casually in the making for much of my adult life, but I really got serious and aggressively collecting these photos in the last 20 years, approximately. My father had collected, as many of you know, put a big collection of historic American Indian art together, and I grew up with that exposure and became interested in it seriously as an adult. And we used to pore over historic photographs to gather information about Native American art traditions and tribal art styles. So that was really the beginning of it. And sort of incidentally, we'd bump into little collections of photographs and purchase them. But then in the early 2000s, myself and two other men, we bought out a collection, and we did it as a business opportunity, and we ended up selling most of the collection. But I was tasked with cataloging everything and organizing it for resale. And that's when I really began to learn about sort of the various photographic formats of the late 19th century. What was, learn about the photographers and their work. And it just became really fascinating to me. And I sort of began to plug into the shows and the auctions where these things occasionally surface and become available. And I just decided, well, these things are overlooked and undervalued. And I started, I started buying things, started putting a collection together. And then it just got kind of addictive, and it took on a little life of its own. And even since the things went to the Clements Library in 2016, I haven't, and I must say, very gratifying to see their response. And that's just inspired me to keep collecting and searching for things and adding to the collection. And so it's just what I enjoy doing. It's a fascinating subject. I'm learning new things all the time. I'm doing some just great finding some, and then once you find these photos, you want to do the background reading to learn the backstory to these images and to these events. And it's just something that gets me jazzed, you might say.
Thank you. So you talked a little bit about how long it takes to amass the collection, but Linda and Jim Wilson are also wondering what were the best sources and where were you finding these photos?
I think I cast a pretty wide net. So I'm watching auctions, large and small auctions. I go to these shows around the country. So I've, done a fair amount of traveling in the last 20 years. And that can, and I'm always on the lookout for things. I've gotten to know a lot of other collectors and some of the better known dealers. They would know of my interest and sometimes occasionally hold things for me or channel things to me once they knew I was serious and my checks wouldn't bounce, and you can't really, people wonder, where do you find these things? Well, lately, even eBay, things will pop up on eBay. So I kind of am working all these angles, you might say. But other collectors, dealers who specialize in historic photographs, auction houses that handle American historical materials, and the trade shows that pop up around the country. Those are pretty much on hold right now. But I guess the last few photographs that I bought were at auction. In fact, Jacob and I went down to Cowan's Auctions in Cincinnati about, I don't know, last October, and there was some fine little batch of photos there. There were some albums I was trying to buy, but I was outbid. But yeah, that's about it,
All right, thank you. Sally is asking, did we have Indigenous consultation while cataloging and looking at this collection? So if you can talk about that a little bit, that'd be great.
Yes, Sally, great question. We did have Indigenous consultation throughout the course of the entire project. So we reached out to individuals kind of in the more immediate University of Michigan sphere and the Clements sphere, individuals who were known to us, who we thought would be good people to discuss this project with, who also had a stake in the Native American community. And then we also kind of broadened that. A really big help throughout the entire project has been Eric Hemingway, who's the lead archivist of the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa. He has been extremely helpful giving us feedback on how we're proceeding with things. And we've reached out to several other individuals and groups around the country with mixed response. You know, sometimes we didn't hear back from people, but it's totally an open-ended thing. This isn't to say that, you know, we're done consulting. We absolutely want this to be an open-ended project where we're totally open to discussion with people if they have thoughts and ideas.
Thank you. So this is a great question because I love, you know, how much work you've put into this. Lisa is asking, how do you record the correct ID of the person for the future?
So what I've done for this collection, we decided to create individual item level catalog records. These are searchable in the University of Michigan Library Search. Every single individual photo and every single photo album has its own record. And within these records, I indicate, you know, I'll say explicitly in a note that, you know, while the caption says this is so-and-so, they were erroneously identified as this person, and then I'll clarify the correct identification.
Thanks, Jacob. Related to that, Veronica's asking about IDing the subjects as well, and how that's further confounded by tribal naming conventions, tribal language names, et cetera, et cetera. And I know, you know, that you've made some entries to help expand the accuracy, not just in our own collection, but as others go forward as well.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Also, hi, Veronica. It's good to hear from you. Hope you can have you back at the Clements at some point. But yeah, no, like I touched on a little bit in the presentation, this issue with the many different names that an individual can go by over the course of their life. You know, this is a particularly complex issue with regards to Native American naming customs. You can have individuals that have many, many different names over the course of their life. Sometimes their names are translated in many different ways. And then with, you know, instances like Billy Bowlegs, situations like that, oftentimes you'll have people taking a name that has a lot of prestige in the community. This was a name of a very prominent person. And so you'll see names get recycled over the years. I was reading a book about a northern Arapaho chief named Sherman Sage, and he lended his name to someone when he was in his adulthood. He gave his name to someone for an extended period of time until they lent it back to him. So there's these things that really they don't fit into the conventions around describing these kinds of materials that were designed for you know, Anglo-normative situations. So it's really hard to fully flesh these things out in the system as it is now, how things are structured in the catalog record and using Library of Congress, name authority file, subject headings, and things like that, where you have, you know, it's been whittled down to one name, but this individual might have gone by, you know, 10 names over the course of their life. So we wanted to ensure that, you know, for every individual that has X number of variant names, we wanted to make sure that all those variant names are compiled into a given record of a photograph of that person. So you'll see for things, you know, for the records that have photos of Billy Bowlegs, it will say in the record explicitly, you know, all of the uncovered names that this individual went by over the course of their life. And this is a very iterative process. I'm still uncovering new information about a lot of these individuals. And so, like, please, if anyone knows anything at any point in time about any of these individuals that isn't addressed in the catalog records, feel free to reach out. I'm all ears.
this is one of the exciting things about doing digitization projects at the Clements Library, is it allows us to put a collection like this out further and get more input. And you know, there was a wonderful story as Eric was looking through the photographs, and you know, of someone he recognized because of what, you know, his work at the tribe. So I thought, you know, because we're not open right now, as you can see, Jacob and I are both at home. The project of actually digitizing this collection has been postponed a little bit. Otherwise, we might have been able to share that with you already. So it'll be coming soon. All
Actually, here, I
right.
just saw
So
an interesting,
yes.
someone is asking, Joanne is asking about some of the names seem insulting. Bowlegs, afraid of horses. Seems odd for a person who becomes a chief or is mentioned as an important person. Can you say something about this? Excellent question. In the case of bowlegs, the etymology of that is still a little dubious. You know, for a lot of the stuff, it's totally wrapped up in legend. And so the full truth of the matter may never be fully uncovered, but for bowlegs, that may be a phonetic rendering of Bolek, which the original chief who became known as Bowlegs, I think a name of his was Bolek. And so that became extrapolated to Bowlegs because it sounded similar. This makes me think of another example in the Pohrt collection of these Edward Muybridge stereo photos from the Modoc War. There's one photo showing an encampment, a deserted encampment of a Modoc warrior who is described as being named Shack Nasty Jim. And I saw that, I was like, wow, that sounds extremely offensive. There's no way that this wasn't his name. And sure enough, this is a phonetic extrapolation from the indigenous name, which was Shack Noste. And so, yeah, Shack Nasty Jim, that's absolutely, it's derivative, and it's definitely meant to be derogatory. With Young Man Afraid of His Horses, that is more of a case of kind of mistranslation over the years. I think the original translation of the name should approximate more to giving you a sense of man is approaching you on his horse. The sight of his horse is what makes you afraid. It's not that describing that this man is afraid of his own horses. It's that everyone else is afraid when they see his horse approaching. And he inherited this name from his father, who was known as Old Man Afraid of His Horses. And he was renowned as a very excellent warrior, prominent chief. Yeah, this name, yeah, it's a very unfortunate way of translating it, and it definitely doesn't do justice to what the actual name is supposed to imply. But yeah, you see this all the time. It's a big issue. That's why you need to take everything with a grain of salt sometimes, and just really make sure you're exhaustively researching every angle that you possibly can.
Thank you. So you both might be able to talk about this a little bit. There are several questions about, what portion of the collection is Michigan tribes versus other tribes, and maybe what Michigan tribes or what areas of Michigan are represented.
Dick, do you want to take a stab at that, or do you want me to answer?
Go ahead, and then I'll put an addendum onto it. How's that?
Okay. So I'd say there's tons of photos related to Great Lakes tribes in Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin. I'd say most of the photos are Ojibwa. There's also several of the Potawatomi people who were originally from the Great Lakes. There's numerous photos of them after they've been removed to reservations in Oklahoma and Kansas. The rest of the makeup of the collection, there's a strong emphasis on tribes of the Great Plains, in particular the Lakota and Dakota, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa. Probably least represented would be tribes of the East Coast. There's a couple Iroquois photos and Delaware. I think the vast majority of photos are kind of Midwestern region. And then also the American Southwest. There are many photographs of the Apache.
Was the original collection the Michigan Indians, or just the collection as a whole?
I think the collection as a whole.
As a whole, yeah. I would say probably all cultural areas. Well, if you think of Native American, Native North America in terms of its cultural regions, Northwest Coast, Southwest, California, Great Basin, Plains, Eastern Woodlands. That might be a way to one way to think of the collection. And I would say I've been trying to represent as much as I can, but as a collector, we're always limited by what becomes available in the marketplace and what we can afford and what sort of comes to our attention. I would say some of the strong areas of the collection relate to these seminal historical events of the latter half of the 19th century, as westward expansion took place after the Civil War. And we find Native peoples coming into contact and conflict with Euro-Americans as they move westward. So we have the photographers, this new invention that was beginning to be mastered by some number of people. They were, some number of them went and followed these events and attempted to record them. And that's an important, I think, a real, I'm proud of what I've been able to acquire that is representative of those events. So specifically, the Apache Wars in Arizona in the 1870s and 1880s, the Minnesota Sioux Uprising of the 1860s, well represented, the Joel Whitney photographs, the Sioux Wars of the 1870s through everything from the Custer Battle through Wounded Knee. In the Southern Plains, the conflict between Comanches and Kiowas, and there's a whole series of photos that documents the prominent people there, and then their internment at St. Augustine, Florida. So those are, it's sort of maybe in a nutshell, that's some of the high points, but you almost have to come down to the Clements Library at this point and ask to see some of these images and take a day looking through them.
Yes, we look forward to when we're able to hold public programs again too, of hopefully being able to get them out and talk about them in person like we would have in a in-person Discover series as well. So there will certainly be lots of opportunities to continue to study and talk about this collection. related to what tribes are represented, Cindy, who I know is up by Lake Superior, is wondering if there are any Lake Superior tribes represented.
Yeah, there's a nice cache of photos that were taken by a woman photographer named Grace Chandler Horn that were taken in Emmett County just after the turn of the century. And that was sort of a group of, oftentimes when you're collecting these things, you know, you're getting things in one here and one there and two someplace else, but every once in a while, you'll fall into a group of photos. And this particular archive of, and these would be Odawa people from Emmett County. We're talking Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawas, and they would produce this pageant based on Longfellow's Hiawatha, poem of Hiawatha, every summer for tourists up in the Petoskey area. So there's probably 100 images, I would think, relating to that event. There were a couple of photographers, and moving on from there were a couple of photographers in the Upper Peninsula, Brubaker and Childs, that took photographs of Chippewa Indians up there. And those mostly appear as stereo views. And now that's another, you know, getting back to these photographers, this was a business endeavor. So one of the formats that was used in the beginning, I think in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, were stereo views. So this was a popular format because you could place the card in a holder and get a 3D, would produce sort of a 3D image. Truly, it is very interesting. So they would have a greater chance to sell their images by producing it in a stereo view format. So that's what I have representing the peoples in the Upper Peninsula. There's a few very rare photographs too of Saginaw Band of Chippewa. A fellow named Chapanagans, who was a prominent Saginaw Band of Chippewa chief, and some of his relatives. But other than that, in his, you know, in that they're a little bit, photographs of Michigan Indians are relatively scarce. They were not documented to the extent that, say, people in Indian Territory were, or on the Central Plains in the Dakotas. But I'm always on the lookout for Michigan photographs, obviously.
Along those lines, I know that documenting who the photographer was is an important piece of information in our study of these kinds of images. And so a couple of people are asking, are there many local photographers? And I'm assuming that if there aren't many local Native American tribes, there's not too many local photographers. And are there any Native American photographers represented in the collection?
I don't believe so.
No.
There is a sort of the first, I can just sort of thinking off the top of my head, there was I believe a Kiowa man named Horace Pulaw, who documented Kiowa life in the sort of maybe the teens and 20s. And his work has gotten a fair amount of recognition. I think they've done a book on his work. But prior to that, I'm not sure. It's an interesting question, but I'm not sure if there were any, none that I'm aware of, any active Native American photographers.
Yeah, no, yeah. The only example I can think of at the Clements, it isn't in your collection, Dick. There's the Sophie Toklani photograph collection. It's a really amazing collection of photographs, many of which were real postcard photographs that were taken by a Native American woman, a Chiricahua Apache woman named Sophie Toklani.
Yeah, I'm familiar with those.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that's a good point as well. One of the things that makes a collection like this so great at a resource like the Clements Library is that we do have other resources available, so that if you're studying a subject like this, there are other materials to look at as well. So, Rebecca Zurier is asking if you can tell us more about the clothing worn by the woman standing next to Apanion in the center of the photograph.
You know, Dick is by far and away the more knowledgeable with regards to analyzing the material culture. Dick, that's one of the primary interests in these photos for you, right?
I'm trying to bring up that image in my mind. It's a
I think it's a fringed buckskin dress, right?
yeah, finely tanned deerskin dress. Often they were ornamented with elk teeth, occasionally cowrie shells, which were a trade item. But the most prized and most elegant of those Kiowa women's dresses were ornamented with elk teeth and accented with glass beads, for that matter.
Okay, I was trying to find the actual slide, and I'm not pulling it up quickly enough, but yes, so thank you. Oh, this is an interesting one, Jacob. Olga's asking about the resources that you use to correctly identify individuals, and if you talk more about that and how you created the subject headings.
Yeah, certainly. Great question. For the most part, I used Library of Congress name authority files when they existed for certain individuals. And then I also, for applying visual subjects, used the thesaurus for graphics materials. But this was a really, really big issue with cataloging. There's just a lot of the subjects in use in Library of Congress are, let's say, a little antiquated in some respects, including there's one subject for describing Native Americans of mixed racial heritage, and you can still use this as a subject today. It's half-breeds, which obviously has some offensive connotations. But yeah, there's a great many individuals that did not have name authority files. So there's some instances where I gathered up enough information to the point where I was quite certain that, this individual, there's enough information I was able to scrounge up about them that I felt comfortable, actually generating a name subject for that individual. At some point, it would be nice to go back through the names list I've compiled, because over the course of cataloging, I made sure to keep a running spreadsheet of any individual name that popped up, and then any variant name associated with that individual. So I'm trying to keep very close track of all the names and all the variants that are in usage in these records.
Yeah, someday when we can travel again, you'll probably need to go present at a conference, or at least write a white paper or something.
One of these days.
I know, exactly. So related to that too, Veronica's asking about extended kin networks that don't fit neatly into Euro-American titles, blood son, versus, adopted mentee and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's another potential area where information can get misconstrued along the line. I think there's one example where it was really hard to apply subjects there were a couple portraits of an individual named Steps. And again, this is kind of an ironic nickname for this person because I think their ultimate tribal origin is still unknown. I don't know if it'll ever be known, but they were captured by the Yakima, I believe. And then he was kept outside, confined on one very cold night. And so he lost both of his feet below the ankle and one of his hands. He eventually ended up being adopted into the Nez Perce tribe. And he was part of Chief Joseph's flight of the Nez Perce when they were being chased by the United States Army out of their territory. And it's one of the great, really one of the great military campaigns in world history in terms of what the Nez Perce were able to accomplish against all odds. Pretty remarkable. But they ended up being stopped right on the border with Canada. And they were trying to link up with Sitting Bull's band, who had recently gone over to Canada following the Custer engagement. And Steps actually was able to miraculously escape from the Nez Perce encampment after they'd been stopped and was able to make it across the border and join Sitting Bull's camp. And so there are photos taken of Steps when Sitting Bull's band eventually ended up surrendering. And he's associated with Sitting Bull's band initially. And so then you're peeling back all these layers of ties and this adoptive kinship amongst the Nez Perce. For this one individual, there are so many connections. It's really hard to find the best way to contextualize it all. That's really one of the main goals of why we handled this collection the way we did. Because, when people view, say, especially after it becomes digitized, when people view these records online and they see how they're described, it's again, if people take things at face value, if we had just been transcribing things explicitly as they appear and just doing a one-for-one saying, okay, this is how it appears in this photo, and we're not going to offer any contextual commentary over that, then people will see that in the archives and say, oh, it has this legitimacy attached to it, that we're presenting the information in that way, therefore it must be correct. So we really want to be certain that what we're putting out there is correct, and these are people being correctly identified. And for many, many, many years, for far too long, it's kind of fallen by the wayside, and people have had, they've been misidentified for, hundreds of years.
Right. Thank you. So Astrid is asking for a little more about the Welsh Indians. What happened to the legend, and why was it important for the North American photographers to perpetuate the legend?
Great question. Great question. Long story short, the legend still exists to this day. There are people alive on planet Earth right now who still believe in this. And this kind of falls under the gamut of, there are all sorts of crazy origin stories regarding the peoples of North America, including everything from, their descendants of the lost tribes of Israel to their descendants of this Welsh prince and his party of explorers who came over in the 12th century. There was actually an incident in, I believe, the 1970s of a Welsh man who sailed across the English Channel to France in a traditional, it's called a coracle. It's a traditional Welsh fishing boat that for a long time was kind of people looked at this and they said, wow, it looks awfully similar to the fishing boats that the Mandan used. And that was, another sign that, oh my God, they must be descended from the Welsh. What other plausible explanation is there? Of course, if you look up fishing boats around the world, they all are permutations on the same theme. Yeah, there's even some Welsh guy who he founded like the Maddock Research Institute, something like that. And he is exploring genetic studies to try to confirm this hypothesis. So it's still very much alive and well, unfortunately, because it's absolute hogwash. But getting back to the point of why did the photographer put this caption on there? Many possibilities. He could have believed in that theory himself, and it's just a personal gloss, and he knows that there's many other people who believe in this theory as well, or he's just looking for another way to capitalize on these images, just another angle to present them to people in a way that will pique their interest. And he knows that. He knows that on the East Coast, especially, people who have never interacted with a real Native American person in their life, but they have all these preconceived notions about Native Americans, including this Welsh Indian theory. He can slap that caption on, and he just can bank on that interest, as misplaced and confused as it is.
Do you have something to add, Dick? You look like you're thinking about something.
No, I'm just go on to the next question.
All right.
I will add also, Astrid, that as part of the resources that were linked to as part of the presentation, I did write a article in the Clements Quarto about this, the Welsh Indian theory and how it all got started and various permutations it took. So if you're interested in learning more, you could check the article out.
Thank you. Wow, it's already 5:10, but we'll try to answer a few more questions. I see people are still sticking with us, so I don't want to give up on them quite yet. But Doug is asking, Jacob, if you saw patterns among the photographers that indicate that some were more casual and some and liable to make mistakes, and some that were sort of careful and reliable. So did you see some distinctions in that way?
Oh man, that's a great question. There's certain individuals, certain photographers. One that comes to mind is Frank Fisk out in Dakota Territory. This is a photographer who actually grew up on a reservation, and he grew up making friends with Lakota people. He was very much interacted with them on a thoroughly friendly, genuine basis. So his photographs, his portraits, are generally considered to be quite trustworthy because of the level of engagement and involvement he had with the community he was portraying. Then you'll notice, like Dick, you had mentioned the Grace Chandler Horn photographs. Once you start getting into kind of the early 20th century, you do notice these patterns of photographers just start having Native American subjects wear, the feather war bonnets, this kind of clothing that traditionally is more associated with cultures of the Great Plains. But it ends up being extrapolated to basically all Native Americans. It doesn't matter where your photography studio is. Eventually, they started just handing you war bonnets in the studio because that was the stereotyped expectation of the people buying these photographs. This is how they expected Native Americans to look, which is ironic because it ends up, all of the multitudes of individual cultures, the subtle differences between these groups get totally glossed over and totally misrepresented.
Right.
I would, let me add to also one thing in thinking about that in terms of reliability. Maybe one of the more, when you find these 19th century photographs, generally speak, they're printed on thin board mounts. And sometimes there would be no information, just the photograph glued to the board. Other times, the photographer would put his studio imprint on there. And occasionally, they would put the identity of the subject. So as a collector, when I'm looking, my ideal photograph would have the identification of the subject and the identification of the photograph all right there. And then I might mention that the Joel Whitney carte de visites from the 1860s, Whitney would put the native name in Chippewa, the anglicized interpretation of that name, as well as his studio imprint. So that's pretty good there. D.F. Berry, who was working out of Bismarck and Standing Rock Reservation, would always seem to be really business oriented. So he would always have his studio imprint on his front or back or both of his cards, as well as identifying the subjects. That's one extreme. At the other end are, like I say, people, itinerant photographers who might just take their photos and mount it, and it's left up to myself or Jacob or whomever to make sense and try to identify who this person might be, or who what the tribal affiliation is, or who the photographer might be. You know, sometimes we're looking, at least with studio photographs, we're looking at backdrops and flooring and props, and as a way of identifying the photographers. Some of these photographers, they would put their studio imprint on one period of time, and then other times they're blank. So it's that's part of the challenge, you know.
Yeah.
To
and plus, photographers are swapping negatives all the time. These partnerships are being formed and disillusioned. So it's a changing landscape.
Yeah.
A lot of moving parts.
you know, for the past couple years, I've been sliding little things for over to Jacob as corrections come to my attention, or more attention or information comes that I pick up a little tidbit of information somewhere. So that's going to be an ongoing process.
Definitely, definitely. Like we said, you know, people often think of archives as something stagnant, but they're not. It's something where we continue to add to that knowledge. We continue to analyze it. You know, we continue to use it. So it's a very living sort of resource that's out there, and it's dependent on that continued curiosity and quest for knowledge. Okay, where I thought maybe we would end with, I thought this was Veronica has an interesting one. And I think some of the others, so I don't want you to think that I'm dismissing you, but I think some of them will be answered by some of the resources that we're going to provide links to in the emails. And we'll take a look at all of the questions. And if we feel like there's something that we haven't answered adequately, we'll follow up with you. So don't worry about that. But I thought it was interesting, Veronica's question about your thoughts, Dick and Jacob, on why photos of battles and massacres were sought after and profitable. And, you know, sort of, I think that I saw a question sort of related to that as well, about how we, you know, use these photographs to make sense out of some of those events and to put some things in perspective.
Yeah, so I think unfortunately this kind of just speaks to kind of a broader notion of human behavior. I think it's maybe the same reason why if you if you are pausing your TV in the middle of a football game, you look at the crowd after a really big hit, men, women, children, everyone hearing all the same. Like people like violence. At the end of the day, violence sells. And so I think with regards to these 19th century photos showing battles and massacres and you know, famous participants of a given battle, you know, a big part of that is, yeah, you know, people are interested in violence and reading about violence and hearing about this stuff. Then also there would have been a strong appetite for visual representations of these incidents that people would have been reading widely about in newspapers. People would have heard about these incidents and then wanted to see photos of the individuals involved who were mentioned in these articles, things like that. And there's a market there existing for visual representations. And so these photographers step into that void full throttle. And that's why you'll often see that these photos of conflicts and battles and the aftermath of massacre, things like that, you'll see that these photos oftentimes are the ones that will have the little copyright indications on them. These are ones that photographers were like, oh, this is my breadbasket. Like, I need to protect this image in particular because I know other photographers are going to try to pilfer this from me. And I mean, clearly it was happening all the time because these notions of copyright were not as we understand them in today's world. And also just, you know, pragmatically, like, how do you enforce some of these restrictions on people? Like, people were copying each other's photos all the time. And probably some of the more copied ones were these images related to the scenes of battle.
If I could add, I think that these early photographers, you know, I think some may have thought of themselves as what we now call a photojournalist. So as events were unfolding around the country, they would head in that direction. And some of the earliest, let's remember that, you know, photography only began around, what, 1838 with the daguerreotypes. Some of the first, one of the first images we see of conflict were some daguerreotypists photographed the Crimean War. And in this country, I think one of the major events that we first see documented was the California Gold Rush. So we're talking, you know, 1849, 1850s. And these, you know, photographers following the prospectors that were heading out to California seeking their fortunes. Well, the same thing sort of happened then as these events unfolded in the West, as the American government was subduing and conquering Native Americans and forcing them onto reservations. And you know, the events that preceded and including the massacre at Wounded Knee are well represented in the collection. There were several photographers that as the ghost dance was being brought to the Dakotas, journalists flocked to Pine Ridge and Standing Rock and were reporting to their respective newspapers. and being followed sort of hand in glove by several photographers, John Grable, George Traeger, Clarence Morlich, all these. And, you know, the newspapers were inflaming the events and suggesting that something big was happening on these reservations in the Dakotas. And so maybe there's sort of a natural, you know, outgrowth is that the photographers would head to these areas to record them. They didn't know what would happen, but they wanted to be present for whatever reasons. Maybe they saw opportunity there in terms of business, but maybe they thought it important to make a record of what was happening. It's an interesting subject, interesting to speculate upon.
Yeah.
And hello, Veronica. Nice, good question. Nice to hear from you.
All right. Thank you both. And thank you everybody who participated today and for all of your really good questions. As I mentioned, we will, it takes a little bit for the recording to process, so likely we won't send out the follow-up email until tomorrow morning, but it will also have some links and resources that were mentioned today. And next week is our final episode of the Virtual Discover series on photography, and we'll be welcoming Dick back as one of the panelists. We'll be talking about collecting. So we have 3 collectors who will talk about their collecting in a moderated conversation with our curator of graphics, Clayton Lewis. So that should be a lot of fun. Okay, so thank you everybody. And hope to see you again. Thanks so much. Bye.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.